Hello there. My name's Diane Wittry, and I'm the conductor of the Allentown Symphony in Pennsylvania. And I have with me today the composer Doug Ovens on the call. How are you doing today, Doug?
I'm doing great. How are you, Diane?
I'm doing wonderful. And today we're talking about a performance that we did together in November of 2017. And this was a concert of the Allentown Symphony where we commissioned a work based upon some sculptures by Harry Bertoia, a famous sculptor that lived in this area. But before we get to that, I want to talk a little bit about Doug Ovens and his background. Now, I selected Doug for this project because Doug is not only a wonderful composer, but he's also a percussionist. And I felt that having that background would be really, really important for writing this piece. Doug is on the faculty, or was on the faculty, recently retired, of Muhlenberg College. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about your background, Doug?
Sure, happily. You're asking a composer or a college professor to talk about himself. You're in really deep water. Well, first of all, you mentioned, in addition to being a composer, I'm a percussionist. And frankly, it seems like I've been a percussionist pretty much all my life. I really discovered music pretty early on. But my earliest really serious activity as a musician was playing drums in rock and roll bands. I actually never did, I don't think I ever did any music in school, partly because of a somewhat rebellious streak and for other reasons. But I was a very serious rock and roll player in my teens. And but it's kind of funny, as I got to the age where I was thinking about college, I had lots of interests. I was playing in rock and roll bands, but I didn't consider going into college as a music student. I went into college as a sculptor, actually.
Wow, that's amazing. I didn't know that. So this piece is even more appropriate.
Well, that's right. It's kind of a funny coincidence. I went to this. Remember, I'm 67. I was in college. In high school in the late 60s. So I actually went to a school which was a free school, as we called them back in those days, meaning we had no grades. So actually my main areas of interest were visual art in school, visual art, and radical politics, pretty much. But again, a story for another day. So when I was thinking about college, the classes I took were as likely to be political science courses or philosophy courses or art courses. I studied with a wonderful sculptor named David Cotter, who did these big fiberglass things, like huge monstrous washing machines that filled up with water and shook and lights flashed. And so my interest in college was, I had a very brief college career. I did oxyacetylene welding. I made wire sculptures. I say I had a brief career because, again, I mentioned the radical politics. I dropped out of college after, I didn't even make it a whole year to run for the Portland, Oregon School Board. So this led to a wacky few years where I was a teacher's aide in the Portland Public Schools. I was taking night courses, again, all political science and philosophy, but I was playing nightclubs. And I had the very good fortune to have a wonderful teacher. I had this teacher, I was a guitar teacher. I decided I wanted to have my own band. And I knew I needed to understand a pitch vocabulary to make that happen. And again, I'm out of school, so I don't know anything about anything. I think I know a lot about everything because I've been playing professionally by this time for a few years. I'm playing nightclubs very regularly. But this teacher, and I really want to underscore this teacher listened to the questions I was asking and suggested to me, you really need to listen to, and a long list of names. Bartok was on there. I think Schoenberg was. I think, I don't remember if Ernst Toke was, but I remember I checked out a record by Ernst Toke, which I really liked. But I didn't know any of this stuff. So I went to the public library, and I checked out these records. Remember, a long time ago, vinyl. And it's kind of a funny story because, again, I had this deeply ingrained love or belief in civility in a funny way. And I only mention that because in listening to the Arnold Schoenberg pieces, they infuriated me. They made me so mad. I mentioned this, that I would have broken the records if I didn't have such respect for public property. I was infuriated. Yeah, yeah. It's like Arnold Schoenberg was trying to put something over on me personally. Even he'd been dead, obviously, for 20 years, but I didn't know that. But the Bartok, I listened to the Bartok Sonata for piano and two pianos and percussion. I listened to it, I think, 3 times in a row. I was just transfixed. And I mentioned this because literally the next day, I marched into I was a teacher's aide at Marshall High School in Portland, Oregon. I marched into the principal's office and quit my job the next day. I said, I don't know if I'm going to do this, but I need to be a composer. And
Wow,
so,
you are amazing, Doug. I never knew this about you.
yeah, this is all right. Well, it's a long story, and I apologize for the length, but I'm trying to go fast. So this is the beginning of a school year. So I worked a few more weeks. I didn't put them in the lurch, but I said I have to quit. And I found a trailer sequence in music theory at Portland Community College. And I didn't know how to read music. I mean, I was a drummer. I was a really good drummer. I was a very successful drummer. And I knew my drum rudiments. I could read rhythmic notation, but I had no background in anything else. So I would stay up late many, many nights in like Denny's restaurants, trying to memorize whatever I could from the notes from my guitar lessons. And I got into the theory sequence, and then the abridged version of the story is 8 years later, I had a PhD in composition.
Wow, that's pretty amazing, pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, and so I actually refer to hearing the Bartok Sonata for 2 pianos and percussion is my religious conversion. I mean, it literally changed my life. It changed everything about my life. I moved to San Francisco to study at San Francisco State, where I met my future wife, Cindy Baker, who is now Cindy Evans, who you know very well.
Yes.
And I got my bachelor's in theory and composition at San Francisco State. We moved to Santa Barbara, where I got my master's and doctorate in composition. They put me on the faculty. But through all this, I was always a percussionist. And what was interesting is I was a very motivated percussionist to be a professional percussionist. What I mean by that is I was an opportunistic percussionist. So I played in rock and roll bands if I could find a rock and roll band that was making money. I played country western if that was how I could pay the rent. But in Santa Barbara, I became the marimbist of a mariachi band, and which was a fantastic experience. I just learned a whole new literature, and because again, I'm becoming a composer. I needed to have my primary instrument be an instrument in the pitch world. And so the marimba became my piano. Beethoven was a great pianist. Brahms was a great pianist. I play the marimba, and it is actually my word processor for a lot of figuring out how I want to make melodic and harmonic ideas work out. I'll take them to the piano because the piano is in many ways a more efficient layout, but the world that I actually have this lifelong almost kind of familiarity is the marimba. So as you said, for this project we're talking about, that living in percussion, yes, it really it finds expression in a lot of different aspects of both the Bertoia piece, but also my whole compositional career. You haven't mentioned, but years ago, the first time we met, you were premiering my cello concerto. So I mean, I have a lot of orchestra music, I have a lot of solo piano music, but a lot of it finds at least some part of its genesis from my life as a percussionist.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when I first got the job in Allentown with the symphony, one of the first things I walked in the door, they said, "Oh yes, we've just got this world premiere we're going to do of Doug Oven's cello concerto." And it was really, really wonderful working on that piece with you. And I think that's what started our long relationship of just staying in touch and doing projects together.
Yes, yeah, we've done many. I'm very grateful for all of those. Yes.
Yeah. So this project with the Harry Bertoia sound sculptures. So Harry Bertoia was an Italian artist that moved to the United States. He was born in 1915. He passed away in 1978. And many people in the Allentown area actually own original Harry Bertoia sound sculptures. because when he first did these sound sculptures, they weren't real expensive. They were fun. You would have one on your coffee table. You could make it play. And what they often were these either bronze or beryllium rods that had metal weights at the top that you would touch, and they would move, and the weight on them would create different sort of circles that they would move in. He also created some gongs and some other types of interesting sounds. And he had a barn studio out in Bartow area of Pennsylvania. And there he actually did little mini concerts, and there are actually recordings available. And so I got this wild, crazy idea, you know, way back, and it was probably about 2015 we started talking about this, to work with the Allentown Art Museum, who owned a few of the sculptures, and then Muhlenberg College owned a sculpture, and then some private owners owned sculptures, private collectors. And I thought, wouldn't it be great to gather an assortment of different size sculptures done by Harry Bertoia, and to create a piece for orchestra and sound sculptures. I mean, really crazy idea. And of course, I immediately thought of you, and I knew that you would be able to take this project and just kind of run with it. So why don't you tell us a little bit about sort of your thought process after I called you and you know, told you about this, how you came up with the inspiration for this piece and what different types of techniques, because you really invented some new techniques of how to play these instruments.
Right. Well, first of all, yeah, there's actually one thing I was actually thinking about as I was getting ready for this morning is there's another part of my background that also came in very useful in preparing this, and that's my background in electronic music and computer music and music concrete. Because like percussionists do this, and people who write for percussion do this, but also electronic musicians do this, and that is juxtaposing what we kind of sort of sometimes slightly lazily think of as non-pitched sounds versus pitched sounds. Because in reality, almost every sound is pitched. Rossini, I think, actually always wrote for bass drum. He actually wrote it as a pitch, if I remember right. I have to go back and check that. But he usually, and I believe he did that because he had other aspects of himself that were lazy, but that wasn't laziness. He thought of them as being almost like a kind of slightly less focused tympanum. Well, anyway, so part of the way I approach this is the first thing I did when you approached me with it is I got my hands on the Muhlenberg sculpture. I knew it was in the president's office, so I told the president I needed it.
You told the president. Love it.
Hey, I need it. You're not using it. I need it. So I moved it. I had it moved to the electronic music studio because I was teaching there, and that was a place where I could have it protected and I could deal with it. Because one thing that hasn't come up yet, now, because Bertoia is famous, these are incredibly expensive. And yes. So I think you had to write, or somebody had to write like $3 million worth of insurance riders to make this all happen. So everybody I approached about a sculpture, I had to in some way or another allay their concerns about any damages. Well, anyway, I moved it into the studio, and so I started playing with it. And as people who see the piece will see, and just as you described, they do kind of sway and they make this lovely motion. I actually, growing up as a very young kid in Walla Walla, Washington, and seeing lots of long waves of wheat, that's actually one of the first metaphors that occurred to me was waves, fields of wheat, and the wave motion through tall grass and with wind manipulating these tall stalks. And so actually one of my first titles of the piece was Wave Motion. And I have a lot of sketches where I would play the sculpture, and then what I would imagine was the violin section as that field of wheat. And so what I wanted to do was both project the musical event, the sound, through this section, but also one of the lovely things about an orchestra is just this incredible experience. of both being this magnificent auditory experience, the biggest auditory experience one could have, especially in like the late 19th century, but this big auditory experience, but it's also this huge visual experience. We have all these people dressed alike, and normally in normal orchestral music, moving together. And so there's this lovely visual element. So I'm imagining, again, going back to my metaphor of the field of wheat, making this glorious sound, but that moving through a section and perhaps moving into another section. You know, it's funny, as musicians, we spend our whole life doing this, so we start making these really, sometimes it seems very odd connections. So I started thinking of the Bach, Brandenburg, that's all for strings, where we often have all the strings standing except for the cellos. Right. And the same thing happens there, that the gesture, we're hearing these lovely gestures being passed off section to section, but we also see them moving. And so that was really central. And as you mentioned in the comments at the introduction of the premiere, that you have to reseat the orchestra from the way you wanted them seated for the Beethoven performances. And one of the things that happens is you can actually see a gesture move through the section. So that was taken directly from the piece. The thing that I wanted to get at is, it was very important for me right from the outset. I wanted this to feel like a piece, like any other piece, where everything is organically wedded. And the easy part is the contrast. The easy part is these sculptures are not like the instruments of the orchestra. The difficult part is, how do you make something that sounds and feels compositionally like it's really organically wedded? So I had to pay a lot of attention to the way these creatures behave. One of the sculptures too that this is kind of funny, one of them you didn't mention was from Bethlehem City Hall. And so, right. Yeah, it's the tall, very resonant sculpture. This, like you say, it's the stalks with a big weight on the top. I think that family of instrument is called the Sonambients. And anyway, so I went to Bethlehem City Hall, and it was a regular work day. This was back in the days when we could actually go out in the world. And I went to Bethlehem City Hall, and nobody was around, and I started playing this thing. And I was kind of worried I was going to get arrested, because, you know, it's this public space and they're kind of loud. But I have to find out, you know, so and what I'm doing is I had my phone with me, and I was making sound with it, and I was recording it, because I needed to have recordings of the instruments I knew I was going to use back in my studio at my piano or wherever I was working. Because again, I was always trying to mesh these things together. So I was taking recordings of them. I was getting the pitches that are most prevalent. They aren't real focused. So any one of these, you can't play any Bertoia sculpture and say, that's a C sharp. You can say, there's C sharps in there, and there's E's in there, and there's C naturals in there. And the C sharps are slightly louder than the C naturals. So that's the kind of thing I was doing. And again, that kind of makes it perhaps a little more obvious why the musical gestures go the way they do, because I was, again, kind of mimicking the behavior of the sculptures.
Yeah, you know what's interesting, Doug, is the way you created a notation for these sculptures. And I have to tell you, I have framed in my office at the Symphony your notation page for what you were playing from when you performed this piece. Can you tell our listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, I can even hold it up. If I don't know if this will. Yeah, there we go. They can probably see a little bit of it.
Yeah, isn't that great?
Basically, what I had to do, one of the other interesting aspects, well, you know, this is just basic orchestration. Whenever you're writing for large massed groups of instruments, you have to pay a lot of attention to which instruments are strong and in which registers, or you're going to cover up this sound or that sound. But at the same time, you have to do something that we don't pay attention to now in modern times so much, because so much is done for us electronically. There are all these devices constantly monitoring our sound, and they're called compressors. And so what they do is they make quiet moments less quiet and loud moments less loud. So we have this broadcastable band of sound that's relatively consistent. When we're writing for a big acoustical sound group like an orchestra, we don't have any compressor on the flutes in the low register, and we don't have any booster on the string basses so that they can compete with the cello. Well, same thing with the sculptures. The sculptures, I had how many? 9 sculptures, and I'll tell you a little secret. Nobody's listening. A couple of them were in the piece because I had 9, but they weren't the most useful. There were a couple that were there because they made a beautiful set around me. So
right, right, and they made maybe one unique sound that you could use them for, but they didn't have the variety as some of the others.
Exactly. So there was a little of that, but there were some that were very rich, and also, frankly, remember, we're in a big hall that seats something like 1,500 people. And so there's a few of them that could really reach the back seats. And there are a few of them that were very intimate. And so, I mean, conceivably, I believe they did reach the back seats if I wrote a moment that brought us down to a quiet, both in the orchestra and also, it's not just in the orchestra, you bring the audience to a place of quiet where they're leaning forward in their seats so you can play this tiny little sound, and it gets to it gets to them, and then you can bring in the slightly louder things. I don't even remember where this question started, but in any event, that's one of the things that I had to do a lot of. So that's right, the notation. So what I did, and it was actually kind of there was a lucky coincidental part of this project. You recall, I set up my performers' percussion set of sculptures in the art museum for, I think, the week before the premiere. And that was very lucky because I was able to go in before museum hours and practice, because again, I never had all these things together in my studio. Some came from Ursinus College, the one came from Bethlehem City Hall, 3 came from the art museum, and then I believe a couple were private. So they were brought together for this exhibit on Bertoia sculpture, and I placed them in this orientation. You'll see this little horseshoe thing with
hold that up. Hold it up so everybody can see it. I want them to really see it.
Yeah, is that good? And so my score is almost like guitar tablature, in the sense that the notation says the physical action. This notation, the numbering of the sculptures, I would have a number in my score, and that tells me what I'm setting in motion. And then I would have a shape or a physical drawing, and that was my cue to myself what I did. So, sculpture 9 over here on the far edge, I do this and this and this, and on sculpture 7 I do this, and I just have these parentheses things, and then sometimes I would make them very dark or I would just write FF if I wanted, very loud. Sometimes I used regular accent marks, and sometimes I would just have little wave shapes when I wanted to note another thing where I hit the symbol that Val Bertoia lent us, the gong. I would hit it and move my hands like this above it, and I was actually being the motor of a vibraphone. And I remember when we did one of the demonstrations for the symphony listeners, the season ticket holders, I think it was, I did that, and I did this, and I looked at the audience and I said, "You can hear that, right? Because if you can't hear that, I'm looking pretty silly." But of course they could hear it, because what I was actually doing is I was actually physically interrupting the air motion, the wave motion through air molecules. I mean, I was actually being like like I say, the rotors in a vibraphone. So the notation served a lot of purposes. First of all, as all notation does, it was my memory jog in the course of the performance. This isn't like you're a touring pianist doing Brahms' second piano concerto for the 50th time in your life. So I wanted to have that clearly laid out, but also, again, it was a way of working out which sculpture's sound moves well into which other sculptures sound, because I was trying to write a meaningful shape for these in the same way that if I was doing a percussion concerto and I had a gong and timpani and cymbals, you want to make a shape that is meaningful moving from these one sound to another.
Yeah, that's great. In closing, do you have some words of advice that you might want to give to some young composers out there? Obviously you can start composing at any point in your life, and from any point, you just proved that you could go from a point of not reading a note of music to getting a PhD as a composer, if that's what you really want to do. So what are some words of advice you'd like to give our listeners today? Well,
and I want to give full credit to where I got it. The best advice I think I ever got from, I studied with many, many wonderful composition teachers, and I learned great things. And again, I learned a lot from my guitar teacher at River City Music, who got me started on this thing. But the best advice I ever got was from Roger Nixon. And he said to me, after I wrote a really ungainly cello line in a chamber piece, he said, write gratefully for an instrument. And what he meant by that, and I extend it to be write gratefully for the instrument. So respect and value what any instrument does well. Know the literature for that instrument. Every composer, Hindemith was famous for saying this, the composers have to know more than anybody, because you have to embrace every single instrument that you're going to write for. If you're going to write for the clarinet, know the clarinet. Spend time finding out all of those different lovely registers, know what chalumeau means. Write gratefully for the instrument, but also I extended that in my own thinking to write gratefully for the player. Understand as much as you can how these players approach their craft, what they do to prepare themselves for that moment that you're sharing when they're playing your music. And also write gratefully, and this is going to sound a little funny, I think. Some people who've heard a lot of my music will think this is funny, but I really believe this. Write gratefully for the tradition. My music is certainly not conservative. I don't know how to write a conservative piece. Well, that's not exactly true. But my music has always been, I think, kind of, I like things I've never heard before. I'm always pushing myself to try to find that thing that when I hear it, I go, oh, that's gorgeous. And I don't recognize it. I mean, that's sort of my own impetus. But that comes from a place of this, again, I love the orchestra. I love writing for the orchestra. I love writing for a great pianist. I love writing for a great singer. I love the fact that these people spend all day, every day, working over the tiny to the huge problems of their craft, their world. And I love the fact that I can draw on their worlds and try to make some synthesis that, again, a person I hope will listen and go, that's very cool, and I don't recognize it. I mean, those are the sort of the two poles I like. There was one other thing I just want to be sure I did. Oh, I mentioned this actually, again, I watched the video that you sent me the link to. I mentioned when I introduced the piece that orchestral musicians, and I just love orchestral music, and I've played in orchestra a lot, but they work tirelessly to play together. And I mentioned the fact that in most of my piece, I don't let them do it, So, but again, it's because they are both capable of having this one kind of agency where they are a part of a big corporate glorious sound, but they also have individual agency. They are smart, they are musical, they can be, it's almost like a musical version of federalism, I guess. they can actually have their own sphere of influence within this large entity where we sometimes come together and we sometimes go apart. And hopefully the result of all that will be something moving and something that kind of, again, there's a part of me that I love scientists too. The idea that we as musicians are kind of expanding, we're expanding the notion of the possible. Something that didn't seem possible yesterday, maybe we can do some little tiny thing to make it seem, not only seem possible, but maybe even necessary today. So it's expanding the world of possibilities. Again, possibilities is a word that turns up in a lot of my titles because it's a word that I like very much, the idea of ever expanding possibilities.
Yeah, that's great. And you know, I think everybody's going to see that expansion of the possibilities when they hear the recording of the first performance of this piece. And it was such a wonderful time that everybody came together in the community, the Allentown Art Museum, the Symphony, and everybody was so excited to hear this wonderful work. So I want to thank you for your wonderful ideas and all the things you told us about today about composing. And we're really looking forward to hearing the recording and the video. So thank you very much.
Thank you.